Professional cyclists can ride over 100 miles in a single day. Now, this alone sounds impressive, but remember that for races such as Tour de France, they repeat this feat over and over for 3 weeks with very little rest. As you might imagine, the nutritional requirements for these highly trained endurance athletes is complex, as they often consume over 7,500 calories per day while doing this feat. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that professional cycling teams are dedicated to testing the latest in nutritional science. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with David Bailey, PhD, a performance consultant and sports scientist who has spent the last 20 years supporting elite athletes and 10 years in professional cycling. I found his presentation to be fascinating, and I think you will too. For those of us who are not in the cycling world, learning about the training principles and the competition strategy of professional cyclists can be an analog for any of us who are seeking to optimize our own health, nutrition, and performance. Make sure you stay tuned for an offer from Timeline Nutrition after David's presentation so that you can experience this innovative metabolite that is being celebrated by athletes and consumers around the world is the ultimate in mitochondrial optimization. And now we present David Bailey, PhD. Enjoy.
Thanks so much. Great to be here and share these insights with everyone. It's hopefully of some interest. Maybe you'll learn something new, but really a fantastic opportunity to share what is a passion of mine with you all. Just to start off with, you're probably wondering who I am. My name is David Bailey. I currently work as a consultant and sports scientist, born out of many years, about 20 years experience working in elite sport, and most recently 10 years working in the world of professional cycling. That's road cycling, mainly based in Europe. My expertise is in exercise physiology, and I did a PhD in sports nutrition and exercise physiology. And I've become a more generic performance specialist over the years, obviously linked to the specific demands of working in the sport of professional cycling. Just to start off with, I thought to give some basic principles of training would help people understand the kind of theory underpinning cycling performance, and certainly give a bit of background when I go into a bit more detail as to my role and the demands of professional road cycling. So any coach, athlete, anybody working in any sort of sport context where physical preparation is important will understand the stress response curve. And put very simply, it's every exercise effort, every training session is a stress, which ultimately stimulates a response. So looking at this chart here, you see on the left is a measure of performance, the left y-axis, and along the bottom, the x-axis would be time. And the red line shows what happens when you train, and that training is suppressed. Your performance, so as a result of the load that you might do, the intensity and the duration, which is the stress part. Then afterwards, you recover and you supercompensate. So that adaptation phase, which goes above the baseline, is what we all know and experience directly when you train. You do training, it's actually a stress on the body. It's sometimes not so enjoyable, but it does lead to an adaptation. And that adaptation is daily, or is during a training week or months or even a year. It's the fundamental process that happens at a physiological level which drives training adaptation. And we can play around with that. So if you give more load, you can potentially get more adaptation. If you give too much load, then maybe you compromise how much you adapt to training. So you've heard of underperformance syndrome or overtraining. How you recover can be influenced as well if you prioritize recovery, nutrition, and that can help maximize adaptation if you provide the right nutrients, for example, during that period. And all of this is centered around peaking, trying to provide enough stress to get a response that gives you your optimal peak in response to training. From an energy systems perspective, you can represent this in three main components. So again, on this chart, on this occasion, we have power output on the left, which could also be running speed if we're talking about running, but in this example, it's power because that's what we can measure on the bike, how hard you push on the pedals. And then duration. So the duration there goes from, as you can see in the brackets for the different energy systems, from seconds up to hours. And you don't get a nice linear decline in power with this. It's sort of curvilinear, and that's because of the different energy systems involved. So when you exercise for a very short period of time, sprinting, explosive, high intensity work, you're working your alactate system. So that's your phosphocreatine system. That's when you generate energy within the muscle to provide that explosive power, which gives you the high peak power outputs. But that's not sustainable for a long time. If we go to the next energy system, which is a minute or 2 minutes, is your anaerobic lactate system. So many people are probably familiar with lactic acid production, and it's often measured in the blood as a measure of exercise intensity. And this is a period when your body generates energy by breaking down glucose, so carbohydrate, and produces lactate when there isn't enough oxygen present to fully metabolize glucose. So it often gets a bad press, lactic acid, but it's actually a very efficient energy system for those durations, for 1 or 2 minutes. And that's where you get to. If you exercise a little lower intensity, so as you see the power is coming down, that's when you switch into your aerobic endurance system. And that's what, as humans, we're best at. And we can generate power or run at a certain intensity for extended periods of time using fuels like carbohydrate and fats and oxygen to break them down to provide us with power output for hours on end. And that's the go-to energy system for endurance athletes. But that just gives a nice summary of the 3 important energy systems that underpin performance and training. When we train, we often talk about training zones, which are listed along the bottom there. There can be anything from 4 to 6, depending on how you determine them. But what people often ask me, well, what's the principle behind that? What's the basis to that? So often you might do a lactate test and see what intensity, whether it's running or in cycling, the power you produce lactic at. So that's understanding where that energy system starts. And then back calculate your zones, so zones below that and zones above that. So in this chart, you can see that zone 4 is around about your lactate threshold, so your anaerobic threshold. And you can see for the zones below that, you get different types of adaptation to training, and the more moderate to easy zones versus those that are higher up. So 6 and 7, you can see you have anaerobic capacity, which makes sense because that's what I've just explained, as that's what you're using predominantly at those intensities. And also neuromuscular power and increased fast twitch muscle fibers. And then the other adaptations are mitochondrial enzymes and glycogen storage, so that's the storage of carbohydrate, as well as your plasma volume and your blood capillary, sort of your cardiovascular system. They actually stimulated across zones. So that's the factors that perhaps underpin basic adaptation to endurance training. And then the more specific anaerobic and sprint work is what gives you those more specific adaptations at a physiological level. So how does all this work? So any coach and athlete will understand that it's not just going out and hitting the same training session day in, day out. You have to understand how to plan that training to ensure that you can peak at your highest level at the right time. So for a given competition, a marathon, a cycling race, a grand tour like the Tour de France. And that isn't just the weeks before, that's up to a year before. And that process is referred to as periodizing your training. And that's simply factoring in and phasing in your training through a year or through months to ensure that you get the right stimulus at the right time. And here you see a very simplified version of that. So on the top you've got peak performance, and you can see the arrow increases as that peak performance increases. And then you have down the left-hand side competition, specific conditioning, general conditioning, and the phase. So you can see this is over a calendar year. So that early part of the year, there's a lot more focus on general training, and then you specify into the first competitions. If you're a professional athlete, you obviously compete multiple times through the year. And as you see, as you progress from left to right, there's an increased emphasis on specific conditioning to the racing and an increased emphasis on competition with the goal to peak at that key event. So if we were talking about a cyclist preparing for the Tour de France, then in the winter months, they're doing more general training. And then in the months leading up to competition, they focus more on that. And that's going back to those training zones. That's the first part of the year, focusing on the lower intensity work to build up general condition, and then specifically on things like progressing your threshold or your anaerobic capacity and also your neuromuscular power. So having mentioned professional cycling and World Tour cycling is like the Premier League, the top level cycling, just take this opportunity to give you a little bit of an insight into what that looks like and how my role as a performance scientist fits into that world. So the competition season in professional cycling is uniquely long. If you look at the bottom there are 38 World Tour races, which is in excess of 250 days. And that's a lot of competitions compared to other endurance sports like marathon running or Ironman triathlon. It's a global event. It starts in January in Australia and then runs through to the final event being in China in October, November. The races that people have perhaps heard of more commonly are the Belgian Classics in March, the Giro d'Italia, the Tour of Italy in May, the Tour de France, perhaps the most famous one in July, and then the Vuelta a España, so the Tour of Spain in August, which are represented there by the flags. Each team has around about 30 riders. There are 18 teams in the World Tour League. Each rider is limited to a number of race days. So although there's a lot of racing, the cyclists actually aren't allowed to do more than 80 a day on the basis that it's considered not to be healthy to do more, but that's another debate. But what's important to know is this is just the World Tour Series. There are other races, so there's probably in excess of 500 race days a year. So it represents a fairly unique sport with a lot of competition days, which presents some challenges when it comes back to periodizing training. Each team is comprised of different types of riders. So perhaps most famously, there's the team leader. It is a team sport, although it's very individually focused at times. So the team leader is the rider that will go on and win the big races, and they're obviously a team priority. A lot of resource and time is invested in their specific preparation. They typically race less, so they can focus on peaking for performance. The domestique, which is a French word to mean workers, are the riders that are there to help the team leader and help the team achieve their objectives. So they typically have different characteristics based upon their specific roles. They might be good at climbing, or they might be good on the flat or in windy conditions. Their general role is to be more consistent over time, over actually peaking for specific events. As a result, they tend to race more and accumulate a higher load. These are the riders that will be pushing that 80-day limit. You also have the neo-pro, which is the new riders in their first or second year, and they're younger typically and tend to be developmental focused and have a generally reduced total load. And then finally, you have the specialists. So there are certain elements of professional cycling like time trialing, which require specific skill focus, and these specialists might be given the freedom to race these events within Grand Tours or within stage races. And they have specific skills, specialist training, and often the riders, the athletes that drive innovation and technical development in the sport. So just to give you a specific example of a very famous race and introduce you into how I work, we focus on the 2021 Tour de France. So that was last year in France predominantly. And my philosophy and the philosophy that I've used over the last 20 years is a performance demands focus. So when it comes to working with athletes in these environments, it's sort of, where do you start? What do you look at? And the most obvious way for me has always been to understand what you're trying to achieve. You know, the Tour de France is a 3-week bike race, and it requires certain physical characteristics. And here you have Tadej Pogačar, the Slovenian rider that was the winner of the race last year. And there you get quite a nice summary of his physical characteristics. First of all, you could argue he's a neo-pro because he's still quite a young guy, 22 when he won the race last year. He's of average height, and weight is low, I guess, compared to other sports. Because of the nature of cycling, you're climbing uphill against gravity. So there's two main factors they're overcoming: gravity when they're going uphill, and air resistance when they're going on the flat. So it's important to be light and lean, hence his fat mass there of 6%, which is, you know, very, very low. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with skinny cyclists. His VO2 max, so his ability to use oxygen at maximum, is of the highest. I think it's only cross-country skiers that can have higher scores, but his is exceptionally high. His peak power output there, PPO, so that's his sprint power, is 1250 watts there, and we often express it relative to body weight, so that's why you'll see watts per kilo. His maximum power for 5 minutes, so you're talking about that anaerobic area or aerobic power, is 500 watts. And then perhaps most well understood is this FTP, so functional threshold power. So that's the point where you switch between your anaerobic metabolism to your aerobic metabolism. and it's given the sort of maximum power intensity that can be held for 40 minutes. And the benchmark for a Grand Tour rider is in excess of 6 watts per kilo. So in Tadej's case, that's over 400 watts, and that's what they'll be doing in the race. But most importantly, what they'll be doing after 4 hours of racing. So it's not just the ability to do that completely fresh and recovered, it's also the ability to do that at the end of a long day on the bike in the mountains and day after day in a Grand Tour. To give you specific context, that's what a Grand Tour looks like. That's specifically what the Tour de France looked like last year. In excess of 3,400 kilometers in total over 21 stages. And they can split the stages up into their different demands. So 8 flat stages, that doesn't mean they were pan flat, but generally less climbing. 5 medium mountain stages, which probably didn't have any big mountains in the Alps or the Pyrenees. 6 mountain stages with 4 summit finishes, mountaintop finishes. And that's key, because that's where you separate the people contending the overall race from everyone else. 2 individual time trials, also significant because they're on their own and they're against the clock. And then multiple climbs in the race. So on the right, the chart there shows you stage by stage the total climbing, as well as the distance at the bottom of the bars there. So you can see it's 9 days and then there's nothing. That's the first rest day. So there are 2 rest days during the 3-week race where they don't have to compete. They still train, but they don't compete. And then there was a second rest day after stage 15. So you can, looking at that, you can see the distribution of the race is that there was some climbing at the beginning, some stages 7 to 9, and then sporadically for the remainder of the race. So again, thinking back to how that rider has to perform and how far into the race that's significant. To make that a bit easier, I've highlighted it in red. So you can see the days, the bars in red represent the days where the overall race was decided. So the winner of the race won't win every stage because there's no advantage to it. But if they're looking to gain time and be the first to Paris, with the fastest time, these are the days that will be signaled as being significant. And with the technology we have these days, we can actually predict the demands of those days. So you see on the left there the stages and the estimated time for the time trial. That's the first one. It was a 35-minute time trial. Also, stage 20 was a time trial, which is around 40 minutes. So that, again, helps understand the performance demands and how you might prepare for that. And then for each of the other stages, you can see the estimated time on the climbs. So relative to body weight. So remember that golden figure of 6 watts per kilo. So you can see all the way up to stages 17 and 18, there was a demand for in excess of 40 minutes of climbing into the 3rd week of the race. So I guess the take-home point here is that it's a big physical challenge and it has to be sustained throughout 3 weeks of racing. So here to summarize the demands that underpin the Tour de France, you can sort of split it into different components. I think sometimes the media like to focus on a particular innovation or a particular component of performance, but it's very, very easy to get distracted with the marginal gains. It's often that we forget the big ones. So what I've done here is simply summarize everything that contributes to performance in the race that you can control ultimately. We can't control everything, but factors from the physiology, which I've discussed, to psychology, recovery, which is obviously important during a 3-week race. And then the team tactics, the strategy behind performance. So the time spent by the team investigating this and working on equipment as well, the development of technology to help improve performance, as well as the environment. So what the conditions they're competing under. They go from the cold in the north to the altitude in the mountains. And then nutrition. So fueling is super important when you're exercising for this long. And it certainly is a highlight and a point I want to stress a bit more in a moment. So here is a typical day for a cyclist competing in the Tour de France. You've probably heard of the amount of calories they might take, up to 7,500 there at the bottom. Predominantly carbohydrate, because that's the main fuel that we're using during the race, and protein to help with recovery and maintain muscle mass, and some fats. But the day starts off with breakfast, and you can see some examples there, high in carbohydrates, some protein there. And then just before the race, they will go and, just one moment, sorry, I'm going to stop here because I can hear radio. Please, can you turn that down? I can hear. My apologies, Alice. We can perhaps edit that out. I'll just start this slide again. So here we have the typical day in a race in terms of nutrition, which I just highlighted as being an important component of performance. You can see here that it's probably well known that there's a lot of food that goes into the riders' bodies during the race. At the bottom there, you can see that the calorie intake can be in excess of 7,500 calories. That's not the case every day. It depends very much on the demands of the day. But that's predominantly made up of carbohydrates, because that's the main fuel source for performance for endurance sports. Some protein is in there as well, which is important for recovery and maintaining muscle mass, as well as fats. And here, just looking through the day, you can see it's a day of eating as well as performing. So breakfast is listed there, some typical items that the cyclist might consume, predominantly high in carbohydrate. Then before the race, they will take extra carbohydrate, typically a sports drink or some rice cakes. And that's not the dried rice cakes you see, but actually prepared rice cakes for high carbohydrate source. And then during the race itself, they'll consume in excess of 100 grams per hour of carbohydrate to meet the demands. And that goes back to the point I made about fatigue resistance. Fatigue resistance isn't just a genetic gift. It's about being efficient and preparing yourself for when you need to be ready at the end of the race, at the end of the stage, and then also in the third week of the race. Immediately on completion of the race, there's refueling is very important, and you can see there that's predominantly carbohydrates again, some snacking, and then dinner, which is again a high in carbohydrate, and then perhaps there's a pre-bed snack which helps with a focus on recovery. Now that particular typical day is adjusted based upon the information we get back during the race. So how hard was the day? We make some estimations beforehand, but we have to tailor that and adjust that day by day to ensure that the fueling during the race and before the race is optimal, and recovery is maximized to be prepared for the next day. Speaking about recovery, here you have an overview of what's important, because when you're racing one day, that's one thing. You want to be fueled and prepared to perform. But if you're racing over multiple days for the course of 3 weeks, then diet nutrition has a massive part to play. And here along the bottom, you see the profile of each stage of the race in 2021. You can pick out the days there where there's lots of climbing, and you can pick out some flat days as well. But yeah, recovery can be broken down into refueling. So carbohydrates of at least 1.5 up to 2 grams per kilo per hour within that magical window of 2 hours. Rebuilding, so like I mentioned, the protein content to help maintain muscle mass and help with recovery. Rehydration, whether it's the summer or not, remaining hydrated is very important for performance. And then repair, which is often overlooked, and that can be particular micronutrients, antioxidants, and anti-inflammatory based things like polyphenols, flavonoids, and vitamins, which are super important to help manage that fatigue and help with optimal recovery so that the cyclist is prepared for the next day. With that in mind, it brings me to the point that's obviously relevant and interesting, and got me involved in this is the performance innovations, and specifically around nutrition. So what I didn't mention when I was talking about the energy system was the importance of mitochondria. So mitochondria are those powerhouses of the cell which help to generate energy and drive those energy systems that I alluded to earlier. And they've gained a lot of attention. They've been well known for many, many, many years, but more recently in the exercising community and specifically the professional athletes, it could be that this particular organelle of the cell is super important, particularly in muscle cells. And I just draw your attention to the bottom right. There was a study that was done last year which showed that actually excessive exercise training or even competition can impair mitochondrial function and decrease glucose tolerance. So that means that with consecutive days and weeks of high training or performance, your body's mitochondria, your muscle mitochondria, can become impaired, which can have dramatic impact upon your ability to generate energy, recover, perform, and also in this case, glucose tolerance, so the ability to take up and use glucose, carbohydrates during exercise. And that's particularly relevant because it's been long thought what's the cause and what are the factors at a very cellular level that drive fatigue, and why are some cyclists better than others. So this was a particularly relevant area of research. It's fairly well understood here, quoted by Dr. Singh from Amazentis, from Timeline, that endurance training triggers biogenesis of mitochondria, which is the increased number, and that helps you to produce more energy, supports those energy systems that I spoke about at the beginning. And also that high intensity interval training also helps to increase the efficiency of the mitochondria, their ability to take energy sources and break them down to provide you with more power, more energy. So clearly these are very important little organelles in the body that drive exercise performance, and that's why there's been so much attention of them of late. To give you a little bit more of a scientific insight into how the health of those mitochondria and your cells are impacted by exercise, on the left here you have a chart that shows cellular ROS, so that's reactive oxygen species, so that's oxidative damage, all the kind of damaging elements that you actually get as a side effect. Because remember, I said at the beginning that exercise is a stress. So when you're at rest, that's managed, and you have it in the mitochondria and out of the mitochondria, so the red and the blue lines. When you then transition to doing exercise, you can see you get an increase in non-mitochondrial reactive oxygen species, so oxidative damage, which can impact your mitochondrial function, and then that disappears or reduces, diminishes after exercise. But here on the right, you can see how that might impact the life cycle of a mitochondria. So the mitochondria is involved in generating energy for performance, as I've mentioned. But if it's as a part of that process, it actually gets damaged from generating all that energy and the oxidative stress that goes on. And you can see at the top there that the exercise-induced oxidative damage can impact the functionality of the mitochondria. And that's well established in chronic illness and disease, but also it clearly has an application in performance. And that process is there's a life cycle in it, there's a repair regeneration process, and antioxidants, both endogenous in the body but exogenous from your diet, play a key role in that process to help maintain the health of your mitochondria. So that brings me to Mitopure, so the bioactive in Timeline products, which is actually a very potent bioactive. It's not actually an antioxidant. It's actually a bioactive that helps with the process that causes repair regeneration, called mitophagy of your mitochondria, and it's derived from fruits and nuts, specifically pomegranate, and it has its sources in pomegranate juice. Mitopure and the Timeline products, the bioactive in there is actually more bioavailable than pomegranate juice, and that's because we have an ability to generate, or some of us have an ability to generate the bioactive from ingesting pomegranate juice, but only about 30% of us. So by making this a supplement, increases its bioavailability, which is its ability to be absorbed and get to the mitochondria where it can have its effect. So as I mentioned, it helps to maintain your mitochondrial health via the process of mitophagy, that cleaning up and repairing of mitochondria. And a typical supplementation based upon the research to date, which has shown a lot of benefit in performance, is a gram a day for about 12 weeks. So it takes some time to increase your body stores. But if you're doing that half a gram in the morning, half a gram in the afternoon or evening, in and around periods of heavy training over a course of 12 weeks, it's really well understood now that it's efficacious to help improve your mitochondrial health and subsequently improve your performance. So its main focus, as my final point says there, it's to improve performance through helping with adaptation and recovery. So you can see its application in the world of professional cycling. So that just leads me to conclude there with the products that are available, and I'm sure that Elias is going to give you some more information on that, as I imagine you're very interested to learn more about the Timeline range. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was amazing. I'm sure you learned something new. And as promised, the team behind Timeline Nutrition wants to invite you to try Mitopure for yourself. It's not just for athletes. A recent study published in Cell Reports Medicine found that urolithin A, which is the active ingredient in Mitopure, increased muscular strength and endurance in overweight individuals who had low physical endurance. This demonstrates that the activation of mitochondria can improve anyone's health regardless of their age or current health status. So go to timelinenutrition.com and on checkout, enter the code CYCLING for a discount off your first purchase. Or if you're ready to share the good science behind MitoPure and earn rewards for doing so, you can become a Timeline Nutrition affiliate. Go to timelinenutrition.com/promotions/affiliate-program. You'll see the link right here. Stay healthy, and thank you for watching.